Signore e signori, abbiamo più influenza, sui tuoi figli di te, Molly amiamo creato e iniziato da New Jersey. Last week today lived presentato da Filtastic, Comics and Art.
Let's fucking go.
Hey everybody, can you hear me? Let me know if you could hear me. I think I had a little bit of an issue with StreamYard. I'm not showing anybody here yet. Let's see. I'm going to go through the chat. Uh-oh, what's going on? All right, so far I see, let's see here. Madam was the first one in. Las Cruces, you're slipping. How are you? Doug, our guest, is just waiting on the backstage or in the backstage at this moment. And I'm downstairs actually today just because the little guy was still eating breakfast. So figured maybe avoid like what happened last time. Just realized I left my water over there. So I'll have to use the coffee to hydrate. Las Cruces, how are you, sir? You're slipping. You weren't the first one in this morning. What's going on, pal? Psychedelic Paul, how you doing? Haven't seen you in a while. I saw Paul jump in the chat last night when I was on Anachronics channel. Joe from Anachronics. We had a nice little discussion. That was the next or the most recent, I guess you could say, espresso mail call. And I think I showed a good array. I was showing some highlights from stuff I picked up from my LCS almost 2 weeks ago at this point. I hadn't been there in like 5 months. It was all good though. I kept calling him. So he was like, oh no, you're good, you're good, you're good. So I showed off Quentin Tarantino trade paperback that I look forward to reading soon. It's still over here. As well as the Rom V series, Rare Flavors. Something different. I figured maybe they might enjoy that. And then I showed off just some stuff that I have here. I have not organized yet. Some of my what ifs. I went back to some of my Godzilla books. I've shown off my Godzilla #1 before, and I've noticed a bunch of people have been showing that off. So I showed off some of the other stuff I have, just from nothing major, from the Dark Horse series, and some from that original Marvel series as well, which includes a crossover with the Fantastic Four that, to be honest with you, I'm a little surprised is not more sought after than it is. And let me see what else. Gen 13, the Pulp Fiction cover. Remember that from as a kid. And then I showed off a couple indie books from a friend I've known through the Joe Kubert School, Robert Piluso. If you haven't seen Joe's show, I recommend that you check it out. It was a little bit of a longer show yesterday. It was almost 2 hours long. But look, you could skip around a little bit, I assume. Fanboy, sorry I didn't get to you this morning, sir. I needed those extra Z's. It's been a very, very busy week, but I'm going to comment on that at a different time. We'll do that during the vlog here. And again, Las Cruces from New Mexico. So let's see. Kind of a quiet day here today. I don't know if everybody's still on Cliff's channel. But yeah, as I said, I had kind of a busy week. Couple irons in the fire, why don't we say. One I'm going to talk about a little bit later on when I do my vlog. Yeah, it's going to be kind of a different week, I guess you could say, coming up for me. So again, you'll hear more about that soon. Wellbore, how are you, my buddy from Canada? He was on. He was in Joe's chat yesterday too. I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, as far as comics go, it's been kind of a slow week for me. I did just trying to think. The only thing I really read, I read the most recent Cable limited series. I had started reading that before, and yeah, it was just okay. I liked that they tied in elements from the 90s, like you saw the. I'm probably going to pronounce the name wrong, from one of the annuals. I think it was called the Imperium. Popped in for a little bit. But overall, I felt like Fabian Nisses, who's a great writer, whose name I probably just butchered. Look, I liked a lot of his stuff in the 90s, but I feel like he didn't have the right tone for young Cable in this one. It felt more like a buddy kind of cop story, which I don't know, just didn't sit well. It was just okay. I did start to read last night Wolverine Madripoor Nights, just the first issue. I'm really enjoying it so far. But enough of that here, too. Jay Pylon, how are you? Nice to see you. Nice to see you. All right, so I guess it's time for me to bring our guest in here. So, look, if you know comics and you're on YouTube, you probably know my guest. He was a frequent guest on Reggie Collect's channel. They launched a great couple good projects, actually, I should say, from there. The Smart Guide to Collecting and in Isolation. And now Doug is out on his own. So I wanted to definitely bring him in. Let's get him on. Mr. Doug, how are you, sir?
Hey, Phil. Good to see you. Good morning.
Good to see you. Good morning. Good morning. So I was just going through a little bit of your credits here. You've been bouncing around YouTube a lot, so I'm going to try not to let's see, repeat too much. So I have my notes and everything. First time I did notes for an interview, so I'm thrilled. I'm excited.
Thanks again for having me.
No worries. Yes,
and hi to the chat. It's good to see you.
The chat's popping. Yeah. So catch everybody up. I know that in past interviews you've talked about Isolation as far as like comparing it to the show Lost. Where did the idea from Isolation start from?
Years and years ago, when I was doing my daily newspaper comic panel, I would just kind of keep ideas that I had for other writing projects. You know, most creative people or writers have lots of ideas, and if you don't focus on one, you tend not to get anything done. So I was very, very focused for 15 years, meeting daily deadlines on a newspaper comic. So I would just put those ideas in a notebook, and I just was very interested in non-linear storytelling and mysteries. And the reason that I mentioned Lost is I actually loved the show, but did not like that it seemed at some point to get off track. I think when they started that series, they had a definitive plan for where most of it was going. And when it became a hit and the network wanted, extra seasons and, 20 plus episodes, because that was how network television was back then, I think the original writers and creative team eventually left the show, and it just became writers setting up mysteries that never really went anywhere. And that bugged me as a fan. I felt, a good mystery should know where it's going before you even start it, have resolutions to those mysteries. And so that was kind of when I say, the Genesis was kind of tied into Lost. It was like, hey, I want to write something that is interesting, like the premise of this show, but clearly knows where it's going, knows the mysteries it's introducing, and knows the resolutions for those mysteries. And I very much feel for the Lost fans, if there are any in the chat. I feel that very much the original intent was that the island was purgatory, that everybody was killed in the plane crash, but those who found themselves alive on the island had unresolved issues, which is why they kept flashing back to their lives. And oftentimes when something got resolved or when they showed a resolution, they died on the island. And they actually left the island and they got into time travel and, all of these tons of red herrings that never really went anywhere. They did, when they wrapped up the series, kind of tie it back into, I forget if it was Sawyer or Jack I think it was Jack at the end, did die and everybody was waiting. But yeah, sorry if I'm spoiling a 20-year-old series.
Yeah, I was going to say, to be fair, come on, it's been decades. Okay.
It's and quite frankly, what I'm saying I think the show was intended to be about was not what it ended up becoming. So and so then I started just keeping notes of ideas of things that I thought might be interesting. And, um, I'm a reader at heart. I read all sorts of things, not just comics and graphic novels. I read lots of nonfiction, history, biography, fiction, and started finding some interesting historical things that I thought could tie really well into a fictional world. So, for those who haven't read Isolation, it's set in many ways in the real world, but it's about a fictional community in a fictional place that does not exist in a real place. And there are reasons for that, and there's some history that will eventually tie into that. But that's kind of where I originally got the idea. And quite frankly, the different stories and the different time periods of Isolation, for those who haven't read any of it, there's 3 different time periods that it focuses on in the secretive community in Louisiana, 1869, 1919, and 1949. And then the community disappears, which is, one of the mysteries, with a researcher in the 90s trying to unpack what happened. Those time periods all time into or connect into real historical things that were going on in the United States during those time periods.
Yeah, I'm glad that you went on to that one, because I noticed, I think it was on Joe's channel. I could be wrong. You were saying each time period in the story, it's almost immediately after. I know the first one was World War I, the second one was World War II. The third one, well, you're saying
the first one was Civil War, then
Civil
World
War.
War I, then World War II. Yeah.
I was missing one in there. I knew. Just missed a giant conflict. Nothing major. So I was trying to figure out, because at what point in the 90s is this one actually starting? Like around what year?
It's 1992, which is also after right at the end of a U.S. conflict.
Yeah, I was thinking about that.
That connects less to the story, but isn't completely unrelated to why. There are many reasons that will become evident down the road why I set this in the early 90s, but for lots of different reasons. But one of them, quite frankly, besides that everything is right after a U.S. war, is that it is pre-cell phone, widespread internet. And I just find that writing a complex mystery in the age of Google, where you can go to your phone and look up anything and, background check Philtastic on your phone, isn't fun because, there's no research, no unraveling a mystery. You can just fact check everything in real time. So I find that setting a mystery before the age really of the internet and smartphones just makes for a much more fun mystery.
I could see that. And I like, you were kind of hitting the nail on the head for me when you were saying, there's different points in history, because reading, I have all 4 issues, multiple copies of all 4 issues. It occurred to me last night as I'm falling asleep, I was like, I still haven't read issue 4. I have to wait for the trade paperback. But every time I've read it, I kind of get a feeling like I'm a big fan of Josh Gates.
Okay.
And I've just had like a big, I don't know, like when he does these, are you familiar?
No. What does Josh Gates write?
Okay. He's on TV. Sorry, I kicked my thing there. on the Discovery Channel. He's basically a really entertaining guy who goes in search of anything from lost places to just different kind of histories, mysteries.
I am familiar then. I just not by his name. I've seen the show. Yeah.
Yeah. And I kept feeling like every time we were looking in one of those past scenarios, especially in the first issue, and I just figured maybe this is just where my brain goes. Like, he does those little kind of recreations in between just to kind of tie history together. And I was like,
yep.
I kind of feel like those are some of these vignettes in isolation for some reason. So he helps me connect the dots on that one. Yeah. I wanted to ask, so isolation's been forming in the back of your head at this point for a good amount of time. You've been living with this.
Yes.
From what we've seen, without giving out too much information, how has the concept of isolation changed, the original concept, to what's on paper?
So it's changed dramatically. And some of that is just through the writing process and especially plotting out a mystery. You have ideas that you want to explore that you think would be interesting. And then as you develop it and you want to make sure that your larger story interconnects well with the different parts, you tend to change characters or find ways to connect dots in a different way that's more interesting than you originally intended. There's a major change that I can't talk about to the original ending of the story that I had in mind versus where I went, that when it's all done, if I told you the original ending, you'd be like, oh, that's no good. And that's why it changed. It was things about certain characters evolved as the story developed. And I figured out it would be much more interesting to go in a different direction with the ending. Interconnecting the characters, of course. A big one was when I was originally writing it, Isolation was set in Alabama, not in Louisiana. Mainly because I went to college in Alabama and was much more familiar with it. I'd been to Louisiana, but I lived in Alabama. As I was doing some historical research, there were some things that I found out related to Louisiana, that made me say, oh, I have to move this community because this will work out really well and be an interesting connection to history that I could not do in Alabama. So things like that happen as the writing process develops and the story develops. A lot of it, I had different ideas for different stories that I wanted to tell during the different time periods that related to what was going on historically. And hey, Beth, and realized that I needed to make sure I connected characters from the different time periods. So that became in and of itself its own challenge, finding points of connection for different important characters at different times. One huge way the story evolved was for those who've read issue number one introduces all four time periods. After that, the story focuses on 1869 with little bits of the 1992 kind of overarching story. And when I originally began to outline it, I was going to tell the story of all four time periods, like issue number one, consistently throughout the story. And I realized as I was doing that outline, it would just be too unwieldy to tell the story that way. You'd have too many characters that you were introducing. You'd have too much beginning and set up at the beginning, too much middle during the middle, and too much to wrap up at the end. And it just, I don't think from a storytelling perspective it would have worked well. There were a couple of cool dot connections and reveals that would have worked very nicely, but overall, I said, look, no, I need to focus on each time period at a time and find a way to connect the dots along the way, which is why all 4 time periods are in issue number 1 and won't come back into play again until the end of book 1, which would be a like issue 12 of the series, the launching off point into the 1919 stories.
So a couple of things I wanted to ask you. First, everybody say hi to Beth. Beth Charlin. She's part of the Isolation crew that puts out the book. She actually did my favorite cover. I have to say, from that purple one is just magnificent. Look, they're all great.
Yep.
That one just happens to be my favorite. Do you think part of the issue, or I should say, is part of the issue you had, I think, with, you were just saying, like with the making the characters connect, is that due to, you think that Isolation was originally planned like as a novel first? Or, I mean, are there any adjustments you had to make going from novel to comic?
You know, I've been doing that kind of issue by issue, adapting a chapter into a script. The original premise and the story, which I've kept to and will continue to keep to, and adapting it to the comic, is that every single chapter or every single issue does focus on one or more murder. So there's kind of a little story in the larger story that is told. The reality is, how you tell a story in a novel form is very different than a graphic novel. You know, you have to really cut down your dialogue. There's times in a novel where it's easier to introduce characters whenever you want, where you have page limits, and if I'm trying to keep an issue of Isolation to whatever, 24, 28, 32 pages, there are times where you're like, I introduced this character early on so I can tie back into them later, but I just don't have the space to do that here. So in the comic, they might just pop up later in the story. So
yeah, a lot of people don't realize too, there's some mechanical differences between comics and really any other writing form, whether it be for novel or for TV.
Yeah.
I'm not going to grab it now. On the back of my shelf here, I have what is it, Scott? I'm going to get the name wrong probably. Anderson's The Guide to Reading Comics.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one thing that immediately when I started opening it, I was like, I never really thought of it this way. In a TV show, if you want to show somebody going to answer the door, the person just gets up, answers the door. In a comic, unless you're doing something like Tom King and breaking up into a bunch of little panels, you have to make some of those creative decisions, just as, okay, I could show him just getting up, I could just show the door opening, or else your pages are just blowing up.
Yeah. And
yeah.
There's I don't know if this is the same book you're referencing or not. Scott McCloud has an understanding.
There we go. Anderson,
okay.
McCloud, very close.
Yeah, and one of the things that he talks about, which is really interesting, is I don't think the reader consciously thinks about this, but a panel border is a jump in time, always.
Oh, yeah.
Now, whether it's one panel set today and then the next panel goes back to the dawn of time and the Big Bang, where it's billions of years, or it is you and I talking to you getting up and turning that doorknob and opening the door in a matter of seconds, it always indicates some form of time break. And as a writer, you have to figure out with your artist what that time break looks like. And then also, what is the right place to end? You have an end of a page, and you have an end of a page that you have to turn. When you're writing a novel, that's not what you're thinking about. You're thinking about that in terms of your chapter. You want a compelling beginning and a compelling end, so people want to read the next chapter. If you're focused on writing a good comic, you want to make sure when someone gets to an end of a page, especially when it's that, right side of the page, you want to end on something that not only makes sense and just doesn't continue, but makes someone want to turn that page.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting element of comics.
Yeah. I mean, look, say what you want about comics in the 90s, but I feel like a lot of writers mastered the turn the page, big shocking splash page kind of thing. And even like I was just talking about before I read the Cable limited series, which there was one particular scene where I opened it up, I was like, oh, if they just emphasize that more, or if they just put this, you would have felt it more. But now it's just kind of like it flops. It's just like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, that's what it is. Trying to read my handwriting. Yeah, you did talk about you did mention, I should say, the working with an artist and whatnot. And you do have a great team behind you with Isolation. Why don't you talk a little bit about them?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, shout out to Beth, who really does pretty much everything on the comic. Beth is credited in the first 4 issues as letterer. She's also in many ways served as like a co-editor on the project, which is awesome. She's done cover art, as you mentioned. She's done a couple of our con exclusive variant covers, which is amazing. And I hope if we're able to continue the series, we get to have Beth do more of those kind of beautiful, abstracted portraits of important characters. Beth is also is also an inker. She has not inked on Isolation yet, but has inked one of our other artists, Chase Works, on another project. And our goal, if we're able to continue the series in comic form, is to have Beth ink as well, which is great. So Chase and Delia are the other 2 main artists that we've had on the project. Delia was the lead interior artist on the first 2 issues and has been the cover artist on all of the issues. And then Chase was like the lead artist on issues 3 and 4. Delia did do in issue number 4, one of the scenes in the 1990s as well. And they're both outstanding artists with, I think both of their styles connect well with the story of Isolation, but they're quite different. Delia more paints and ink washes, and Chase is more of a traditional comic artist, but his art has a lot of energy in it, and is really perfect for action scenes and conveying emotions that are going on with the characters. So they're different, but they both do great work on the project.
Looking at some of his work, he really has like a kind of like a Greg Capullo type of vibe to it. It's really something. And I'll be honest with you, on the first run of Isolation, when issue 3 was announced, like, oh, and Delia's not doing the artwork, there was part of me, I was like, and I understand, she's she's got to do what she's got to do. But when I finally got issue 3 and I saw what Chase was doing, okay, this works well. This is good. And just like you said, I feel like Delia's painterly style is great for these tension building, emotional kind of moments. Whereas Chase's, it's got like a nice kind of vibrancy to it that really worked well in issue 3 because you had, and I'm not giving out any spoilers in case you haven't read it, which you should. You had a lot of more kind of action heavy sequences, we'll say, in that issue than the prior 2. Yeah. And in case you haven't read it, I guess this is the perfect place for me to mention, in case you didn't know, I think everybody here does know, Doug is got about 5 days left in the Kickstarter.
Yes, we're in our last week now. Yep.
Yeah, you're taking the victory lap. Congratulations, you got funded pretty quickly.
Thank you.
And that must have been a load off. I could tell.
It was.
Yeah, I have to say you have some of the more creative tiers I've seen. Like some of those bigger ones, I was like, wow, man, he's really shooting for the fences there. And you have to admire, like, Doug will take you to the city and wine and dine you at New York Comic Con.
I will fly you out to New Jersey and be your host for like a Thursday or Friday through Sunday, like a 2 nights, 3 days, take you out to dinner, take you into the city, get you a badge for Comic-Con, take you out to breakfast, Uber you to and from the airport, answer questions about isolation.
Give you milk and cookies, tuck you in, whatever you need to do.
That's one of the big ones. And I'll say what kind of inspired that was Keith Knight, who is a pretty famous cartoonist in the alternative newspaper cartoon scene, who has a long-standing award-winning comic called The K Chronicles. When he did a Kickstarter, he was in a band, and one of his high Kickstarter goals was like, if you back it for 10 grand, my band and I will hop in the car, drive out, and play a concert at your house. And I was like, well, that's cool. I'm like, I can't do that, but I could certainly bring someone out to New York Comic Con and give them that experience, as well as introduce them to, creative team members like Beth, and make it a really fun weekend.
And, we joke about, these are these big kind of pie in the sky goals. But look, I mean, in all seriousness, I think first of all, it's just fun to see something like that. It shows a sense of humor a little bit. But hey, look, you never know, because maybe there's, some like Netflix executive that's like, I need a project. Let me go on Kickstarter. What's this? All right, here's 10 grand. Let me hang out with this guy and see if this is any good.
And I think that one's only 6,000 too. So it's like, if you were gonna
shells, there you go.
Yeah, if you were gonna try on your own to like book your flight, your hotel, your Uber, your food, and get the New York Comic Con badge, it would be in that range, So I try and make it somewhat, where we can raise a bit of money for the project and give someone a great experience, but it's not also like, hey, 3 times what you would pay to do it yourself. So
plus you get to hang out with Doug, and he gives you a minor tour of northern New Jersey.
Hey, there might be a New Jersey YouTuber who lives very close to me who'd be willing to join us for dinner as a surprise for the evening. So you never know.
There we go. Now I just need 6 grand.
There you go.
It's funny too. When I was talking about doing this interview, I was saying to my wife, I was like, what's a good idea? What if I tell Doug we're going to keep it really local right now? Meet me at Church Street Bagel outside. We do the interview there. The kids will be outside. She's like, we have a 6-month-old and a 2-year-old. It's just not going to work.
I don't know
if I go meet him? Like, don't.
Who knows what the internet would be like? We'd both be sitting on our phones. Yeah, for those who don't know, Phil and I live like, I don't know, less than 10 minutes away and meet up for coffee sometimes.
We're due. We are due for one.
Yes, we are. We are. Absolutely.
Things have been a little hectic here. We're going to hear about soon at some point.
All right.
Going back to the artists for a second,
have
you considered doing? I know that you said Delia was in for a sequence in issue 4 in the 90s. Do you see yourself doing more things where it's like, okay, in this issue, if I have 2 or 3 different time periods, I'm going to put a different artist on each time period?
That's tricky, and it's somewhat driven by the artist's schedule, the amount of time they need for a project, and what their other, their outside work life impacts. So, it's one of those things where when an independent comic or any comic has to change artist, it's like always that, initial kind of gut punch to the reader, because they're like, oh, it's different. Why did you do that? The reality is publication schedules of independent comic series It's not like there's a Marvel or DC writing, salary checks or, making sure that there's 10 to 12 issues a year. And because of that, that impacts and artist availability. In a perfect world, if someone wrote me like, hey, here's $2 million, finish the whole series, then I could probably do something like that where I could book artists, like say, make this artist for this time period, this one for that, get them all working, get it on a more standard schedule. The reality is that's, unless one of your viewers wants to be a true patron and cut that $2 check, that's probably not going to happen. So while I think it's pretty cool, and I think isolation works well that way, I kind of, we're taking it issue by issue, understanding the realities of the constraints that we have on us. So
now, let me ask you, you just said you're taking it issue by issue. Do you foresee yourself at some point saying, hey, rather than put out individual issues, I'm just going to do a collected trade every few months or every few years? Or is it something you'd prefer to keep kind of like a traditional comic issue?
My preference at this point, as doing this independently, would be to put out trade by trade. I know comic collectors might not like hearing that, but the reality is it's easier to read a larger chunk of the story in a trade than issues that are coming out once every 3 months, 6 months, whenever you can do it. The reality is that you have to raise a lot more money to do an entire trade at once. So, if the Kickstarter, really heats up in the last week and we were to hit, a much higher level than we're at now, then I would absolutely greenlight the next 4 issues or complete Ghosts and Nightmares. Where we're at now, we're really, really close to being able to pay our art team an appropriate rate to do chapter or issue number 1 of Ghosts and Nightmares number 1, which is chapter 5 of Isolation.
Good. You're not going to do like renumbering or anything, are you? Or just because I know you just referred to this as part 1 of this.
Yeah. So because each trade is its own story, the next issue will be Isolation Ghosts and Nightmares number 1, which is the 5th chapter. If at the end there will be approximately 236 chapters, but there will be 9 story arcs. After Ghosts and Nightmares is Isolation Revelation.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's not going to be like a Marvel Legacy numbering type of thing.
I mean, internally, we'll probably indicate the chapter number, so it's less confusing for someone completing it. But yeah, each will have its own title and pretty much 4 issues in the arc.
Okay. Now, let me ask, from what I've read about writing, after, and I've been living with this story now for quite a long time. How close do you feel to these characters? Is it, I'd imagine some of them have to feel almost like next door neighbors or something to you. And that must be a bigger gut punch when they don't make it, I guess.
That's a great question, Phil, because the way I know I'm getting too, emotionally connected to a character is when, especially with the mystery, not that it's not character driven, because it is character driven, but there's a lot of plot. It's not, hey, I'm creating this person, exploring their emotions and seeing where they take me. It's like, I have to know where the story's going, especially one that's about murder and murders. And so oftentimes I have a vague idea of a character. Like I know kind of a little bit about who they are, and I know their importance to the story, and I know when and how they will die. Not that every character dies, but a lot do, because again, it's about these 3 time periods of extreme murder. And
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm getting too close. So when I start writing the character and I flesh them out and get to know them and how they talk, and their voice lives inside my head when I'm writing a script. When I get to the issue that character is going to die and I'm struggling with it, I'm like, is there a way? Maybe what's the way out? Could I,
Is it a flesh wound?
should I have them survive? Is there another purpose for them that I could? And then I have to stop and say, no, you need to stick to it. And it can be a gut punch, like writing there in Ghosts and Nightmares #1, which is not the Kickstarter is the collection of the first 4 issues. The next issue has the first really big gut punch death. Not that there have been some emotional deaths before, but the first 4 issues are introducing and bringing these characters that are important to the reader. So none of those really important characters that someone has read for multiple issues, gotten to know them, have died yet. And issue 5 and 6 both have really gut punch deaths of characters that some people are not going to want to see die. And that I would say is the one way I could kind of compare Isolation a little bit to Game of Thrones. Like, if you're a Game of Thrones fan and you watched it and all of a sudden someone that you were like, oh, that's one of my favorite characters, and they just got killed, it untethers you a bit, because people are used to, like, well, this is the good guy, this is Batman, this is Superman, this is Green Lantern. They're not going to die. Or if they do, they're going to come back to life.
Yeah.
Isolation, there is no coming back to life. A death is a death is a death. And some of the major characters are going to die very soon. And that's tough writing it, because you like the character and you've gotten to know them and you want to keep them around. So,
and I like that you make that distinction, because my wife hadn't read any comics until we started dating.
Yeah.
And it was kind of funny, as we progressed with our relationship, I'll be like, oh yeah, they're killing Wolverine. She's like, wait, they're killing Wolverine? No, it's fine. It's comics. He'll be back, 6 months. Yep. And even I'll be going over history with her. I was like, oh yeah, this character died. They got better. They're good now. And it's to the point where I remember as a kid, Death of Superman, I guess, was really the first big one where it was like, oh, he died, but he's better. And ever since then, the publishers have been kind of like, yeah, we'll rebirth them, or well, it wasn't really them, or it was a Skrull. And it loses, as a literary tool, I think, from what I can see as a reader, it loses that oomph.
Yeah.
So to speak.
I agree. And Robin on the screen, I will answer that question in a minute. Finishing this, I remember that happening with Jean Grey. When I was reading comics, I would say the 2 characters who died that I was aware of as a reader were Jean Grey and then Tara in the Judas Contract, in the New Teen Titans by Wolfman and Perez. And I was there for them bringing back Jean Grey and was kind of like, well, that kind of loses some emotional punch. And then I think after I stopped collecting, somewhere in high school, they brought back Tara, and it's just become a thing. Like, a writer can kill a character, and another writer can revive them. With Isolation, that is not the case. A character dies, it just like any of us in the real world, we're not coming back, and now, they're not. So
that being said, could you still explore a story from their past before they died, or is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that comes into play with nonlinear storytelling. There could be a flashback, or if isolation were to, you know, complete and I had time, there's, you know, lots of backstories of characters that I don't have time. So, for example, for people who haven't read or people who have, there's a character Grey Wolf who I find extremely fascinating, and he's probably the closest thing to like a Batman character in the story. It's not a superhero story, but he's just a great warrior, and I would love to tell the story of how he came to be who he is, because he starts out this way. There's not time in this series, so maybe someday if I have time, I can write stories about Grey Wolf in his earlier years. But
I don't want to encourage you to do that too much, because I do want isolate. I do want to see the end of isolation at some point.
I won't do that until it's done.
Yeah,
I won't do that until it's done. But you know, there's interesting things like that. And isolation is a pretty big world, and it gets bigger as the story goes. So there's lots of room to explore other things like that eventually. Someone asked the question about Kickstarter.
Yeah,
and I wanted
to Robin here.
Yeah, I don't want to forget that. So Robin, I believe my understanding of Kickstarter is when you back, your information is private. It doesn't, I don't think it shows the name of the backers publicly. It just shows the number of backers that have backed a certain thing. So your information solely goes to the individuals that are going to fulfill your order. There's a place for notes. So if you want something like a signed book personalized, you can ask for that. I will say one of the things that I've been doing during the Kickstarter, and I actually need to do it later to catch up, is I do on Instagram thank backers, but I don't use their full name. Like, so if, you know, if someone backs by, you know, their YouTube name or Instagram name, I'll usually shout that out. If it's by their actual name in Kickstarter, I will only shout out their first name. So I might say, you know, Robin, thanks for backing it. So it's meant to protect anonymity and not get you spammed on other mailing lists. So I just wanted to let you know. So yes, the short answer is if you go on Kickstarter and you back it, it's not like the world's going to say, oh my gosh, Robin bought the New York Comic-Con package, I'm going to hit Robin up for money. That's not how Kickstarter works.
That's true. I never thought about that.
Yeah.
But
I backed many projects and never had that happen. So
I'll say this, Robin, if there's a particular tier that you're eyeing, act as soon as you can, especially if they, especially if the numbers are getting down. Because I've had a couple times I've logged in and I'm like, oh, I forgot my credit card's downstairs. I'll do it tomorrow. And then go on. And it's like, oh, that one's done already. Okay. Let me look at it.
Yeah. And Robin, sorry, we have to know who backed you to fill an order. Like we'll only, if you sign up and back a project, ours is already fully funded. So we know when the project ends that everybody who backed it will be charged and we will fulfill their orders. We only know when you back it, whatever your screen name. After it fills, you get a almost like a survey that you have to fill out with your name and address just for those who are doing the project, so we can actually send you your reward or whatever prize or thing that went with the backing. So we, people can just donate and that's fine too. But if you back a certain tier and you get a signed book or a book or original art or, some of the special extras we have, then you fill that out after the Kickstarter for those filling the orders so we can do that.
Yeah. And Robin, I don't know if you've read any Isolation yet, but if you haven't, this is a perfect time to catch up. Even if you just do the digital copies or the one trade paperback, it really is a unique and I think a special story, at least so far.
Thank you.
And not just because Doug is right here. But now, let me ask
It
you.
is not a traditional comic book story. I'll say that.
Oh yeah, yeah. No. If you're looking for good guy, bad guy, no, this one is not that type of story. It's something deeper and different. And I mean, just kind of as Doug alluded to earlier, we've just seen the tip of the iceberg here. I don't even think we've seen the tip yet. Maybe just a glimmer.
I do say it's a complex mystery in that there are many mysteries that are still being introduced. There's many that have been, and there's more to be introduced throughout the series. But every single one of them already has a bow on it in the outline, so that all the questions we raise are answered throughout the series. Hey, Trev, good to see you.
Now, speaking of just the complex mysteries and everything, I know that you said this is going to be around 36 issues, give or take.
Mm-hmm.
How much of this do you have outlined or noted or on track to flesh out?
So the entire, like literally chapter by chapter, has been outlined from beginning to end, with all the mysteries, kind of what happens, why it happens, the deaths, character stuff. That is outlined out. The first 12 issues I wrote, for those who haven't, I've told this story before. I actually wrote Isolation as a draft novel, and then while I was revising it, it got greenlit by Reggie through Swolger Publishing and then I shifted to comic form. So I've essentially been adapting chapter by chapter. So the first 12 chapters are completely written. I just adapt them to script form. After issue 12, then I'm off book and on outline. The reality is I'll hopefully get to begin scripting or writing the second novel, in the next 6 months, so that by the time we get there, I'll have a lot more of that story developed.
Well, I'm sure maybe there's enough people here in the community that will send you reminders like, Doug, you start that second one yet? Come on.
Absolutely.
What are you doing online in this chat? You need to be writing.
Yeah. Get off the chat and start writing.
Is part of this outlining process, are you outlining maybe some of those mysteries separately? Because if it's that complex, I'm just saying, because I think back to, take it back to comics for a second. Hickman, at the beginning of the current X-Men Krakoan stuff, I know very early on, he said, I had a great idea with, I think it was Exodus. And he's like, and I totally forgot about it and messed it up. He was going to make it where, I don't know if you read, he was going to see, I think, Rusty and Skids to take it back. And apparently he was the only one who'd be able to see them. But then he accidentally had another character interact with them. It's like, oh, okay. Well, that was a good idea that I ruined. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, it's why you outline and why you keep your notes. Obviously, things can change. You hope not to make an oops like that. It's one of the reasons why, one of the benefits of writing it as a draft novel first is a lot of good writing is rewriting and refining and going back and catching those mistakes. If you're writing episodic comics, you're not given the time to do that. So you're more likely to have an oopsie that might affect the story down the road. So
yeah, and this is something I have always wondered about with comics. Whenever there is a mistake, and this was something that first popped in my head during the whole Batman Damned Batarang situation, we'll say.
Yeah.
It's like, so, yeah, and DC says, oh, this was a total mistake. It's like, you had the artist, the inker, the editor, you had like 3 or 4 hands at least touching this, but it was a mistake. It's like, no, come on.
No.
Let me ask now, prior to this, you said that you wrote a comic strip.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
Comic
find
panel.
it?
Yep.
Do you find it more challenging to write a daily comic strip that's entertaining, or comedic versus a deep mystery like Isolation? Or what are the different challenges? Maybe I should say.
They're very different, types of writing. I would say the biggest challenge with the comic panel was that it was daily deadlines. So whereas with this, I can take my time, I can rewrite, I can, as I plan it, change ideas. You at some point you have to release it into the world. So otherwise it never gets published. But you have a lot more time doing something long, and it takes more time. It's a lot more complicated. With the newspaper comic panel, it was like, okay, I need 24 separate panels every month, and I need to get them done by this date, so it goes up on the FTP site so the newspapers can download them and publish them on deadline. So there's a lot more like, okay, I have 22 that I really like, 2 that I wish could sit in my notebook and I could play around with more, but I don't have the time. So, there were occasionally times where I put out a comic that, not that I disliked, but I'm like, if I had more time to let that one simmer in my brain and play around with, I might come up with a better version of it, but I've got to get it out to meet a deadline. So that's very different.
Just out of curiosity, did you ever, let's say, like 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, say, I want to revisit this and make a little tweak to it and see, almost remaster it?
You can do that absolutely with gag panels, and I know that I did. I might have had an idea for a gag that I thought was like okay, and then I figured out a way to do it differently and change it enough where I would kind of reuse the basic idea but change the gag. And sometimes you do there was a time, I forget when I noticed this, where every once in a while, especially over 15 years, I wrote literally thousands, but probably close to 3,000 comic panels. And sometimes you write a panel and then afterwards you're like, man, that seems really familiar to me. And then you don't sleep because you're like, did I read somebody else's panel and did it, get stuck in my brain? And now I, unintentionally copied somebody, or, so that you end up trying your best to make sure that didn't happen. There was one time I realized years later when I was going through older comics for book publication, where I released the comic, say 1 year, and then I realized I'd done the exact same panel like 6 years before.
Oh, wow.
So I had an idea, I put it in my book, did it. 6 years, 1,200 comics later, I was like, oh, that's a good idea, and did the comic. Or I found it in my notebook, and I have a system where I mark ones that I use. Basically, I dog ear something if I haven't used it and undog ear. But like somehow something happened and I literally redrew the exact same comic 6 years later, didn't know.
Well, you look at it that way. Look at it that it was that good of an idea that you needed to revisit it or that it came up again. It's funny that you say that, 'cause prior to the pandemic, I was going to comedy clubs all the time. I would go 3 or 4 times a month sometimes.
Yeah,
I'm hoping that we get back to that soon. But kids, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of similarities to stand-up that, from what you're saying too. First of all, I've often heard that for a lot of writers, comedy is much more difficult, or even just gags to write, than anything else, because it's more black and white. Like you want to go for the big laugh. You don't want to go for the, okay. But even in the comedy world, I know that there is a big stigma and a fear about copying other comedians. And
accidental plagiarism. It,
yeah,
that's gotten a lot worse, I think, with with the internet, with social media. That happens all the time with everything. But I do think, one of the things you have to realize, whether it's a stand-up comedian or someone who writes a newspaper comic panel, you have hundreds of people trying to figure out what's funny about this character or this situation. And there's going to be repetition. I was always very, very, very careful to make sure that if someone released a comic that was very similar to one that I'd done years before, and you get the pitchfork mob on social media saying that's plagiarism, that I would always write a defense for the person. I would say, hey, that's not how it works. Like, there's a really good chance they never read mine and they had a similar idea that they thought was funny. I wrote a comic where it was like Luke Skywalker as a baby, sitting in his high chair, mashing food in his face, and Ghost Obi-Wan says, "Use the fork, Luke." And I was like, "Oh, that's great." And I put it out. Many years later, I was reading like an Al Jaffe retrospect of comics that he did for Mad, and saw that he had done like the exact same gag for Mad Magazine, like, in like 1979 or something. And that happens. And where it becomes really, really obvious is with editorial comics. They'll release collections of the best editorial comics of the year. And on a certain day, like, we won't get into politics. Something big happened in the news this week. If you go online and read all the editorial comics that were written like the day after that happened, you'll probably find 10 that are almost identical. And nobody was copying each other. It's just, they're like, okay, what's the gag around this court case or this whatever is going on? And you'll get similar ideas. So
it's not a case like Seinfeld where Elaine absorbs a Ziggy comic from her boyfriend's sheets.
And that I will. There are people who intentionally plagiarize, and that happens in comedy. As well. But if you see a comic and they're pretty unique and creative, and they do one gag, if you watch enough comedy, you'll be like, oh, Jim Gaffigan did a gag that I saw, a very similar version by, Stephen Wright or Jerry years before. Trust me, Jim Gaffigan is not risking his career to try and copy one funny gag that he heard a comedian do 10 years before. It's just not the reality.
And look, there are some comedians I know, like I know Jim Norton did it. I don't know if he still does it, where he refused to watch any stand-up just so he could say, hey, look, no, I didn't copy you. It might be something similar, but and that you have to respect, because you don't know if, hey, look, these comedians are sitting in back of the room waiting for them to come, waiting for the act before them to get off. You don't know whether they absorb something and just don't even register it. But yeah, I mean, look, we could talk for hours about that kind of stuff. I'll tell you that. One thing, because we are over an hour, I do want to be respectful of your time, especially it's a nice day, and I have to pull weeds too. Why don't you tell everybody, just, again, big pitch now, the final pitch for the Kickstarter.
All right, so if you go on Kickstarter, search for Isolation. Mine should be about the first thing that pops up. And it's and my name is on the project, Doug Bratton, and you can follow me on Instagram, doug.bratton.9, the number 9, and I have updates there. But the Kickstarter is a collection of the first 4 issues. It's about 112 to 115 pages of story, plus a lot of bonus content. that should be really fun. We've already hit 2 stretch goals. We're going for our 3rd. But Isolation is a complex, nonlinear mystery about a secretive community hidden in the mountains of Louisiana, away from the rest of society. And it had 3 years of extreme murder and then disappeared from existence in 1949. And a researcher in the 90s comes across some hidden documents and starts to try and figure out what happened. And that endangers her and those around her as the story of Isolation, the community, is revealed.
Yeah, and I'll say this too. If you have not read Isolation yet, this is the perfect opportunity to really get into a truly unique story. And I'll say this too. I'm personally an advocate for digital comics. Buying a physical copy, but also reading it online. Just for a variety of different reasons. And yes, you can get digital copies of Isolation, but there are 2 exceptions where I say the physical edition is better than digital, again, when it comes to modern. One is Peach Momoko. The other is Delia. Only because if you take a look at a physical print of this comic and you look closer and closer at it, you can see the different brushstrokes and just the energy in it that you, in my opinion, lose a little bit in digital translation. So look, if you want to read it and look at it too, just get a digital and a physical copy.
Yeah. And thanks to Trev. Trev put the link to the Kickstarter in the chat. So if anybody's interested in checking it out, it's there for you. Or if you follow me on Instagram, I have the link in my bio as well. So thank you, Trev. And I was on Trev's show last week.
Yeah, Trev,
great guy.
Trev is definitely a boon for our community here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Doug, I want to thank you for coming on and talking with us a little bit about Isolation today. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in, whether you're doing so live on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever you may be watching, or even if it's on a replay, that's perfectly fine too. Remember, if you are watching on a replay, today is Saturday, June 1st. You only have, is it 5 days, Doug?
5 days. Yep.
5 days left. So never been a better time than right now to back it up. All right. Well, again, thanks, Doug. Thanks, everybody here. And I'll leave you like we always do. Peace, love, and comics.